So good afternoon, everyone. Today is Monday, March 8th, 2021. The time is 1:03 p.m. This is a special meeting to consider funding options for the Attorney Center. Attending are Commissioners Duncan, Brooks, and Filios. Do we have any changes to the agenda? Hearing none. Okay, so we have a single item, which is to review the general obligation bond process for the Attorney Center building with Treasurer Steve Matheson, who'll be joining us shortly. Finance Director Dina Darrow, and our special guest and expert Danielle Quaid with Hawley Troxel Attorney and Zions Bank.
Which is Christian Anderson?
Oh, okay. Welcome. Name again?
Christian Anderson.
Okay, and Mr. Christian Anderson from Zions Bank.
Can you hear us okay?
I can, yes.
And do you prefer Chris or Christian?
Christian's great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. All right then. So without any further delay, I think I'll just turn it over to Danielle. Go right ahead, please. Okay, yeah, please.
No, well, you've got a microphone
You've got a
right
mic
there.
right there.
Wherever you're comfortable.
Just try to
Okay.
get it within a couple inches if you can.
Okay, is it on?
Yep.
Yeah, it's on.
Perfect. Okay, so I believe Christian's going to share his screen and share my presentation, but you all have a copy of the presentation in front of you. So, Mr. Matheson.
Danielle?
Uh-huh.
They would need to, the host needs to allow me to share a screen, so I can do that. Oh, there it goes. Thank you.
Perfect.
Go right ahead, Danielle.
So Mr. Matheson asked me to come and talk to you about the different options for financing for the Attorney Center. And so we're going to talk about a couple of different options. The first one being the county's general obligation bond authority, and the second one being lease financing. So just kind of starting with the role of bond counsel. Bond counsel is a specialized legal expert that's asked to give an unbiased and unqualified opinion that the bonds are legal, valid, binding, and enforceable. And in the case that you issue them, tax exempt, also tax exempt. So we provide a specialized opinion that's very different than what you would see in a typical legal opinion because it is unqualified, which means that we have to be firmly convinced that the highest court would find in our favor. And for us, that means the Idaho Supreme Court in most cases. And so we believe that you have to have an actual Supreme Court case on point to be able to predict what the Supreme Court is going to do. So 5 years ago, we wouldn't have been giving you this presentation on lease transactions, even though they were happening other places, because we didn't have a Supreme Court case on point. Now we do, which allows us that flexibility if folks want to utilize it. So that's kind of what the bond counsel purpose is. We still can't see the presentation, Christian. I don't know why.
I'm sharing it. I don't know if they can change which
We'll get it on.
video, because it looks like the county is also sharing their screen.
There we go.
There you go. We've got it.
Okay. So turning to the next slide is just a picture of our team. I am lucky enough to be located here in our Coeur d'Alene office, but we do have 6 people that do this around the state, and we have a lot of experience in a breadth of transactions all over the state, and for using different finance methods for municipal entities. So the next slide kind of outlines the services of bond counsel. We obviously talked to you about the transaction and structure and give advice on that. We draft all of the approval documents. That's part of our process in ensuring that that we can give the opinion at the end is that the approvals were done properly. We address all the tax exempt bond regulations to the extent that the transaction is finance tax exempt, which this project could be finance tax exempt because it's going to be used for a government purpose. If you sell the bonds on the open market, we would work with you on the disclosure. So there's a disclosure document that has to be sent to potential bondholders. And we would work with you and Christian and the team to draft that document and ensure that the disclosure was adequate at the time of issuance, and then also that you have a plan for the ongoing disclosure that's required by the SEC. And then we do the legal opinions that I talked about, as well as develop policies for your ongoing compliance, both on the disclosure side and on the tax exempt bond side. So turning to the county's general obligation bond statutory authority. So this is the code section that gives counties the authority to borrow for a general obligation bond. So a general obligation bond is a bond that's secured by a specific tax levy for repayment. Commissioner Duncan and I had a little discussion before the meeting about this, and you do not have to levy the tax that is authorized by the general obligation bond. You do have to authorize the levy, because the thing that makes a general obligation bond such it's a very preferred credit in the municipal marketplace, because there is that dedicated tax levy to repay it. So everybody knows they're going to get repaid. Your investors have a very high level of comfort that they're ultimately going to get repaid, because people either pay their property taxes or they lose their property. So to get that high level, you do have to authorize the levy, but you don't have to utilize it. So if you have other county funds that could be used to support the debt service, you can use those, and you can certainly share that with your public during your information campaign to help people understand that there's no intent of a new tax levy to repay the obligations. What you can build with and finance with a general obligation bond for counties is pretty narrow. So this is the statute here. You can erect a courthouse or jail. I would say that your attorney building is a courthouse facility, and I would encourage you to reterm it that way for lack of, sake of less confusion, to the extent you decided to do a general obligation bond. You can see kind of some of the other uses: auditoriums, roads and bridges, purchasing air navigation facilities. But you clearly have the statutory authority to seek a general obligation bond for a courthouse type facility. So looking at that in the near future, you have 2 election opportunities per year, May and November. We want to flip the slide, Christian. Obviously, May is going to come up quickly. We have to provide notice to the county clerk on March 29th. You guys probably have an inside track to give that notice, but I'm sure they still want it on that date.
Well, this morning at 11 o'clock, we decided to put it off to November.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
so
now
you'd be
we
looking, so you have more
Let's change.
time. Perfect, okay. That makes things a little bit simpler. So you would have to submit 50 days before that November election,
It's
which is going to be...
September something. I think we already have the date somewhere in there. So.
Okay, so that gives you time to consider what your options are, and also time for that information campaign, so you can share with the public what your plan is and how you're going to repay it, and et cetera. Because I do think that it's important for that information to be made available to the public. Okay, we can flip to the next slide. So this is just an example of what the election question would likely look like based on the statute. I just put in equipping of a new courthouse facility. You have to have the how much and for how long. Those are the 2 other questions that you really need to answer. You don't have to describe the facility in a lot of specificity. You can choose to put more specificity in there if you want. I also encourage you to give yourself a little bit of breathing room on the project, because it does evolve over time, and you definitely want to have authority to build what you ultimately need to build. So we try to draft the question that way, but the 2 blanks are obviously, how much the building's going to cost, or how much of it you want to finance, because you could certainly put cash in along with the financing, and then for how long do you want to finance it, and you have up to 30 years.
Oh, 30 years, okay.
So then the next slide is the disclosure that's required also to be on the ballot. This is evolving over time. The legislature has been changing this almost every legislative session, but currently you have to disclose, the principal amount, obviously, the estimated interest cost, the total principal and interest to be repaid over the term, and then the estimated cost per 100,000. Obviously, also, if you have pre-existing general obligation bond debt, you have to disclose that, but I don't believe you do.
No.
We don't.
So the pros and cons to the GO bond is the next slide. The pros are definitely that dedicated tax levy, the fact that you are going to get better interest rates because of the high level of security that the bondholders have that you're going to repay. There's less transaction costs. There's actually, frankly, less work to be done by your staff as well as your hired team for a general obligation bond, because it's a pretty straightforward process in the market. The main con, as everybody always highlights, is the 66 2/3 that it takes to get it approved. Do you have any questions on the general obligation bond structure?
Keep going.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the lease transaction structure. So the background, and I know all of you know this, is that the Idaho Constitution requires a 2/3 vote for indebtedness longer than a year. The concept of a lease transaction is that it's a year at a time, and you have absolute authority to terminate or renew every year, making it not a debt that extends beyond a year. Like I said, prior to this 2015 case, we did not give opinions on these transactions because we didn't know what the Supreme Court would think of that, although it was utilized widely in the marketplace and in other states and continues to be. But in 2015, we took a case all the way to the Supreme Court on this issue for the Greater Boise Auditorium District, and the court found that so long as there's nothing that goes beyond a year, no penalties, no insurance obligations, no indemnification requirements, absolutely everything has to terminate if you choose not to renew the lease, then it is not a debt under the state constitution. So with that, we have moved forward in utilizing this as a financing tool for municipalities in Idaho. So the next slide is the structure. Typically, the way that it's structured is a lease back. So you own the ground. I understand where the parking lot, where the building's gonna be built. So you would ground lease that to a bank intermediary who would then contract with you to build the building and lease the whole thing back to you on an annual basis. The ground lease is gonna last the term of the debt. So it's gonna last the 30+ years that you finance the building for, or 10 years, or whatever financing term you select. And then the annual appropriation lease back is for those 1-year terms. If you chose not to renew that lease, the bank would own, or the bank would have the ground lease on the building until that ground lease expired. So what they would try to do is lease it out to somebody else to repay the debt, and then at the end of that, the county would get it all back. So ultimately, you do get the building back, but you have to, the bank has some time to utilize another tenant to get the debt repaid during the term of that ground lease. So there's a graphic that depicts the structure on the next slide. Oh, it's pretty small. But you can see it on it's small on your paper too, I apologize. I can send it to you bigger so you can actually read it, but it's, and so it would be, says city, but it would be county, would ground lease over and then lease back the building. And then there would be a trust indenture that you would sign that would give the rights to the bondholders to what we call a certificate of participation in the lease. So that's what's ultimately sold. The debt obligation is called a certificate of participation. So the pros and cons to the lease financing, the pros are that there's no election, and now there's no judicial validation required after the auditorium district case. And so you can move to the market quicker, right? Like you could decide to start a lease transaction today, and we could work towards getting it done rather than waiting for an election date, et cetera. The cons are that the interest rates are slightly higher than the general obligation bonds, and that and as well as there's higher cost of issuance and more time spent by county staff because it's just a more complex transaction, more documents, more negotiating, more drafting. And then the other main con is that you don't have that directed revenue source. So if you didn't have a revenue source to repay the debt, obviously you need that levy authority, and you don't get that in the lease financing. You have to use your general fund. So then we've done a fair amount of these transactions. There's a few of the more recent ones listed here, but we've done upwards of 10 of them, or maybe even 15 of them since the auditorium district. So we do have good documents. We feel very comfortable with the structure, and feel comfortable that it does meet the requirements of the Supreme Court in that auditorium district case. So that's all I have prepared. I'm happy to discuss or answer any questions that you have. I know that Christian probably has insight too on the numbers and how they play into the two different transaction structures.
Any questions for Danielle or Christian?
No.
That was well done.
Thank you.
I think you anticipated all that, but then of course you have the experience with it as well. Yeah, it's interesting because we can talk about what's preferred, but the fact of the matter, or I shouldn't say the fact, the likelihood of this gaining 2/3 vote is fairly remote, especially in this case. I think 51% would be a challenge. I think 2/3 is going to be almost impossible, but one never knows. What's interesting with the certificate of participation is, on the one hand, it can be, for lack of a better term, nullified by a future board, so to speak. But by the other hand, we tie their hands. Because who's going to come into this when this is either under construction or having been built and is obligated and say, screw it, we're not, forgive me, we're not going to do this. You know, we're just going to let the bank find another tenant. Why would you do that? So do we vacate? Let's assume the building's been built. So now we have however many people in that building, 80, 100. Are they going to be out on the sidewalk with their laptops? So realistically, who would cancel this once it goes forward? Can happen, I know that, but realistically, would it? What's your experience?
I think it's very unlikely that you would actually act to non-renew the lease. And I mean, in the court decisions on this issue, judges have recognized that, right? They've said, you know, it doesn't matter if you're not going to, you can. And because you can, so if there was a financial crisis and you weren't, you know, say the legislature said counties can't tax anymore, or, you know, whatever it was, and you could not make the payment, you do have the ability to non-renew. And in that, or if somebody, you know, gave you a building, you know, say Hagedon leaves you the Coeur d'Alene Resort and you're going to move the whole courthouse down there, you can non-renew. So it's highly unlikely. It's going to impact your credit if you do so, which is another reason why a future Board of Commissioners probably wouldn't do that. But you can. And to me, it's not tying your hands any more than a general obligation bond would be tying your hands, because you still there have the ongoing responsibility to levy the tax, to repay the bonds, even on a project that's built and owned by the county. So you're right. It's unlikely, but it is possible, and that's where the courts have landed. That it's not a debt that extends beyond a year, so long as all the obligations are clearly drafted that way, and that takes careful drafting. I mean, we actually took a draft to the district court, and then they rejected it, and we revised it, and we took it back with absolutely no obligations, even, like I said, insurance, indemnification, et cetera, going beyond that year. So you can really say, we non-renew, and the county has no obligation.
So in your experience, you've done, what, 10 to 15 of these? And I guess all since 2015?
Yes.
So pretty much in the last 5+ years, your experience?
Nobody's non-renewed, to my knowledge.
And they're all obviously jurisdictions, government
Right.
jurisdictions.
I mean, you can see cities, school districts, the Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Idaho Health Facilities Authority. So a wide variety of different municipal and state entities.
So back to the general obligation bond, do you think we have a better chance of selling it if we already had a funding mechanism in place?
You're not selling it.
Right.
You're informing the public. But yes, I do. I think that you, if you can share with the public that we just need your authority, and it's going to be the most effective financing tool, and it's going to be the least expensive, and we're going to pay for it out of our current budget. If you can get that message across, yeah, I think that could make a huge difference. I can't tell you it's going to get you 66 2/3, but yes, I do think that having that in your, sharing that out and having time to do that too.
Right.
Right.
So in the actual ballot language, is there a space to say that? We're anticipating funding coming from this, or?
No.
No.
It's very tricky what can actually be in the ballot question without being electioneering on the ballot. We really want to stay away from taking away people's ability to express their intent on the ballot, and preserve that sanctity. So what you want is for people to have the information they need to walk in and know that they're voting yes. Because if they walk in and look at that question, they're going to get lost no matter what. I mean, I draft those questions for a living, and when I read them in the ballot box, sometimes I'm like, what are they trying to say? So you want your information that's been provided to your patrons to help them make the decision before they walk in the door. And you definitely don't want to end up in a situation where you have a challenge after a successful election.
Right.
We just went through that with the school district up in Ponderay, and it's a real bummer to get to that 66 2/3 and then have a challenge.
Wow.
Bill, any questions?
No.
With the, if a future board, and you did explain this, but I think I'm going to ask you to repeat. If a future board were to non-renew, what are the banks or the lenders' options at that point? They can lease the building. Go ahead.
Right, yes. So their options are to utilize their rights under the ground lease to re-let the building and pay off the debt using the revenues from that.
Okay. But what obligation do they have to us going forward? In other words, if they succeed in renting the building, let's say we were to non-renew, and they succeed in renting the building, and at what point would we have the ability to re-enter the picture, if at all?
At the time that either the debt was paid off
Paid.
or the term of the ground lease, whichever is earlier.
Okay.
And then it would be your building again. And they would have obligations under the ground lease to, that ensure that it was kept in good repair and those types of things. So they wouldn't be able to burn the building down or anything during the interim. They would have to keep it in good repair and, manage their tenants, et cetera.
No, and of course, they wouldn't have the option of selling the building to someone else, would they?
They could sell their ground lease.
They can sell the ground lease.
Yes, so they could sell their rights. I mean, real property you've probably heard is described as a bundle of sticks, but you can
Right.
sell the sticks that you have.
Okay. Interesting.
So Christian, do you have a presentation for us? Or are you just answering questions?
Yes, thank you. Danielle really kind of covered the core pieces there, but I did prepare some numbers
Go right ahead, please.
that I could put up on the screen. I don't know
Sure.
if you have those in front of you, but I'll pull it up on the screen. All right, are you able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just walk through it here. At the top, I'm showing your current market value. I'll note that for a voted general obligation bond, this does not create a windfall to the urban renewal agencies in the county. So we're able to capture that urban renewal value as well. So your total current taxable assessed value that would apply. Now, of course, in November election, it's not even next year's value, it's tax year 2022 is the first value that would actually be taxed and apply. But as of right now, tax year 2020, it's $28.6 billion. So I've based the tax impact calculations on that value. And, given the time, this was based on a May election, so we'd have to revise these somewhat.
Okay.
And I'd be an upward revision, given where rates are projected to go, but not significant, and particularly not in the context of this tax impact. So you can see at current interest rates, current being a few weeks ago, you see total principal and interest. This is on a $20 million project. Average payment just over $1.2 million. The tax impact $100,000 of taxable assessed value. This is the figure that has to be disclosed on the ballot itself that Danielle talked about. $4.22, so extremely low. Now, of course, that's what has to be on the ballot. You could talk in a campaign about, well, if an average home of $700,000 or something like that, whatever figure you want to pick. So, for example, a $1 million property assessed would be $42.20 in this scenario. And then I've got a kind of a range on forecasts. So this was forecasted for, again, a May election. We would be locking rates probably around August in that scenario, just so you understand where these are coming from. You can see the increase here. It goes up between 1.25, 1.27 is the estimate there. So 437 to 444 on that tax impact. So again, we'd have to revise this for that November election, but still, this tax impact is not going to, it's a very small number. It's not at any point going to become a big number based on this $20 million. Also based on 20 years, and I will note that all of the issuance costs are factored in here. So when you put, for example, $20 million on the ballot, We can use premium on the bond issue to fund the issuance costs. So that's your advisor costs, bond counsel, rating fees, underwriting costs, trustee, all of that. We can borrow that through premium on top of the 20 million. And we can't get any more than that, not a penny more. But essentially when it's done, you pay all of your costs with the proceeds. You'll have exactly $20 million left for your project, if that's the amount that was on the ballot. So each of these does already incorporate those costs. On the certificate of participation side, really this was based on the same timing, more or less. And so you can see the difference here. So compared to the general obligation of 1,207,000 on the annual payment, conservatively estimated the certificate of participation to be about 1.23. So a pretty minor difference. Of course, as far as tax impact, it really isn't one. So just I put in a hypothetical figure of, okay, well let's assume for instance that you used foregone to cover this, that you said, okay, 1.23 million, let's take 1.23 million of foregone next year. So I basically calculated the tax impact of that. But of course, if you don't need to take that, it doesn't matter. But just so you'd have something to compare against. Of course, for that, this URA value doesn't apply at this point. So it's just based on the 26.9 billion. So you can see the kind of the difference in the tax cost, assuming you're trying to hold the rest of your budget neutral. And then you can see the rates here. This is what we call an all-inclusive rate. It is, so when we issue bonds or certificates, we're selling different maturities to different investors. So we're not just selling a single 20-year bond. If you're familiar with bonds, typically you just pay interest until the bond matures, then you pay all the principal. That doesn't really work well when you're trying to spread this cost out over 20 years. So instead, we would sell a series of bonds, a 1-year, a 2-year, a 3-year, and so on, and layer them all together to provide an annual payment that is equal. But that does mean your 1-year bond presumably has a much lower interest rate than your 20-year. So what this all-inclusive cost does is kind of just say, okay, well, what are the payments? Let's discount that down to the project amount of $20 million, and what's the effective discount rate that makes that work? So it's wrapping in all of the costs into that calculation. So you can see here on this certificates of participation, 20-year, about a 2.08. So remarkably low rates at this point. And then you can see the forecasts and how we factored those in. Are there any questions on these numbers? I have a few other things or thoughts on Danielle's presentation, but I'll stop for a second if you have
Questions for Christian? Keep going.
Okay. I think it'd be helpful just to note, Danielle talked about the lease structure and a bank participation. You can do a direct, you wouldn't even frankly have to call it a certificate of participation, but a direct lease agreement with a bank, where, you would do the ground lease with the bank, and then they would lease it back to you. That's your lease back. However, for something of this size and a term like this, be very difficult to find a bank that's going to be competitive in that type of setup. So more likely, the way the certificate of participation structure works is there still would be a bank, but they would not be acting in a lending capacity. They would be acting as a trustee. So Danielle listed several of these, Chubbuck, Ada County, Idaho Falls. Zions has a corporate trust department. It's one of the largest in the country. And so totally separate from me and from my department, but they have been an active trustee in that role. Also US Bank, and there's others as well that can fit in that role. And really, they're just acting as the other side of that lease arrangement and then representing the certificate holders. But they do not take any kind of lending position or purchase the bonds or anything like that. So in that way, we're actually selling those certificates to the same investors who would be buying your general obligation bonds. And by doing that and going out to that market, we're able to get a more efficient result and better results, lower costs for the overall for the financing. I think also maybe just to point out, I should have done this at the beginning. Our role that we would recommend or would hope to fill is that of a municipal advisor. So Zions would not be purchasing your bonds. We would not be making any loans to the county. Instead, we'd have a fiduciary duty to the county, and so it's a strictly advisory role. We represent the county's interests throughout the process. And we did that on most of the financings that Danielle listed. We're advisor to the city of Chubbuck, to Ada County, to City of Idaho Falls, and a few others as well. Work exclusively in Idaho. I'm based in Boise. We're the most active municipal advisor in the state. We work with more issuers than any other firm. But again, we're basically an extension of staff. We work on the county's behalf. The only other thing I would note is, well, two things actually. So you asked about kind of that view of, can a board really walk away? That is actually a major point for the rating agencies. It is kind of the assumption that once you enter into a financing like this, while yes, you have the ability to do it, practically speaking, if you're borrowing the money for this facility, it's because you need it. And so it's extremely unlikely that you'd walk away. For that reason, the rating agencies typically will rate that certificate of participation structure just one notch below your general obligation rating. Meaning if the county were to qualify on its own for like a AA1 general obligation, we would expect your COP to be a AA2. So just one step down from that general obligation rating. So it's a pretty minor difference in terms of the interest rate, the impact to the interest rates of having that annual appropriation provision in there. Also, from the rating agency's perspective, the more special use the facility is, the better. It can sound counterintuitive that you might think, well, if we're doing something that easily could be released to another property, that would be a positive. In fact, the rating agencies view it the opposite way. The more special purpose the facility, the harder it is for you or for a future board to say, yeah, we can walk away from this, right? Like you said, you can't have those people with their laptops just working in the parking lot. So, a facility like a jail is going to be viewed more favorably in this structure than just a simple administrative building. So, that really is the focus for the investors and for the rating agencies, that you need this, you're going to appropriate the payments because you need it. But again, as Danielle said, for the courts, for the statute, what matters is that you have the ability to walk away if you want to. The last thing I'll note is just a consideration on interest rates. Interest rates have reached essentially all-time lows. I would, as Danielle said, the annual appropriation, the certificate of participation structure could be done if you as a board wanted to move ahead with that structure. We could have it done, the money's already secured, ready to go before even the November election. I think if the board would like to see this, I maybe propose to do some analysis on, what does the certificate of participation structure look like right now? And you can see there is a differential here where the GO structure, general obligation, is a bit better. But what is kind of the break-even amount that rates can rise between now and the timing for the November election before the GO is actually costing more? Just given where rates are projected to go, I would say, not having done the analysis yet, my gut instinct would be rates are probably projected to be higher by early 2022 than if you were, even with the fact that it's a general obligation, than a certificate of participation issued this year. And I don't say that to kind of push you one direction or the other, just make sure you have the information. It's entirely plausible, I think, that a general obligation, if you passed in November, we would be probably issuing and closing on that no earlier than March 1st of 2022. It's entirely plausible that a GO sold in that timing would be more expensive than a COP sold in the summer. So, but again, I'll leave that to you as a board. If you'd like to see that kind of analysis, I could put it together.
Would you like to see it?
Yeah, I'd like to see it, Christian.
Bill?
Okay.
All three, go right ahead.
And that's it. I'll answer any questions that you have.
Treasurer Matheson, Steve, come forward.
My apologies for coming late.
It's all right.
Hi, Christian. How are you?
Good.
Just a quick question on the municipal advisory fee. Is that also included in the premium? Financed through the premium?
Sorry, could you repeat it? It's a little fuzzy.
The municipal advisory fee, is that financed also through the premium?
Yeah, under either situation, general obligation or certificates of participation, all of those financing costs can be wrapped into the financing itself. Now with the certificates of participation, it doesn't have to be premium like it does with the general obligation, but most likely would be just based on investor preferences. But yes, so our municipal advisor fees as well as bond counsel ratings, in the case of the certificate of participation, title, policy fees, all of that has been modeled into these estimates.
And then just a comment for the board, the direct purchase or the direct lease through the bank is the John Anderson, so you can, if I got his name right, Panhandle Economic Council.
Panhandle Area Council.
Oh,
Is that John or is it?
no, Wally Jacobson. Oh, John Austin.
John Austin, okay, thank you, John Austin. That's the structure that John approached the board
Okay,
with
okay.
about a year ago. And then also just for your information, if you want to talk to another county about the consideration of backing out of one of these structures, rumor has it that Ada County is contemplating at least one of the commissioners on one of the structures that they implemented. I don't know if it was through the corner facility or the jail expansion. I think they used a COP.
Coroner
It was a
facility
coroner.
they did, yeah.
So if one of you guys have a contact at the Ada County Commissioners, I'd reach out to them and get their input.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Any questions for Christian? None? Good job. Appreciate it. Any public comment? Anyone else? Dina, Keith, anyone? Anyone online? Pat, any questions for Danielle or Christian?
No, I don't. Just good to hear from Danielle again is all.
He just said, good to hear from you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you both. Good job. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Very informative.
Well, let us know if you want further, input or as you move forward in your process.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you. And for that analysis, would you like me to send that through Treasurer Matheson, or kind of what's the best channel for sending information?
Steve, would you like it sent through you? That's fine.
Okay,
That's fine, Christian. Yeah, send it to Steve. Yep.
I will. Thank you.
Once again, public comment. Hearing none. 1:43, meeting adjourned.